Most people don't fail financially because they make bad decisions. They fail because their money is structured in a way that guarantees they will break at some point. They just don't see it yet. There is a group that makes up less than 2% of the global population, yet they appear on billionaire lists at a rate 10 to 20 times higher than statistical probability. And no, this isn't luck or coincidence, it's structure. It's the result of a system that has been refined over thousands of years, a way of thinking about money that most people have never been taught. Welcome to Dom Finance, I am Dom. And if you're someone who's trying to understand how to actually build financial freedom, not just make money but build something that survives pressure, survives uncertainty, then you're in the right place. Take a second, hit like, subscribe, because what we're about to talk about today might change how you look at money entirely. I'll be honest with you, when I first came across this idea, I didn't believe it. Not because it sounded wrong, but because it sounded too simple to be powerful. In finance, we're trained to trust complexity, to believe that if something works, it must be complicated. But this idea didn't feel complicated at all, it felt almost obvious, and that's exactly why I almost ignored it. But the more I looked into it, the more uncomfortable it made me, because it started to expose something I didn't want to admit. I wasn't stuck because I didn't know enough, I was stuck because I had never questioned the structure behind my decisions. Think about the advice most of us follow. Work hard, save money, invest consistently, maybe buy real estate, diversify a bit, and over time everything should compound. On paper, that sounds logical. But that logic only works if life behaves the way we expect it to. What happens when opportunity shows up before you're ready? What happens when markets shift and you suddenly need liquidity? What happens when you have assets, but you can't actually use them when it matters? That's when I started noticing a pattern. People weren't failing because they lacked discipline, they were failing because their money was structured in a way that made them fragile. They had value, but no flexibility. They had investments, but no control. And then I came across something that goes back more than 3,000 years, often associated with King Solomon, a system that wasn't built to maximize returns, but to preserve wealth across uncertainty, across collapse, across time. And the idea is almost deceptively simple. Divide everything into 3. Not to chase the highest return, but to balance stability, growth, and flexibility at the same time. At first, that didn't feel exciting. It didn't sound like something that would change your life. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized this isn't about getting rich fast, it's about not getting wiped out while still being able to win. And that forced me to ask a question I had never really asked before. Not how much money do I have, but how is my money positioned when things go wrong? Because maybe the real problem isn't that we don't make enough money. Maybe the real problem is we've been building on a structure that only works when life is easy. And once that realization settles in, the natural next question becomes simple but uncomfortable. If the structure is the problem, then what does a correct structure actually look like? What I found goes all the way back to teachings often attributed to King Solomon, later formalized in ancient traditions, and the idea itself is almost disarmingly simple. Divide your wealth into 3 equal parts. 1 part in land or real assets, 1 part in business or productive activity, and 1 part kept liquid, accessible, ready. At first, I dismissed it. It felt too clean, too neat, almost like something that couldn't possibly compete with modern financial strategies. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't trying to be clever, it was trying to be durable. Because what this framework recognizes is something most people overlook. Wealth doesn't exist in one form, it exists in 3 completely different states, and each state behaves differently under pressure. Land gives you stability. It doesn't move fast, it doesn't impress anyone, but it holds value over time and protects you from inflation and long-term erosion. It's the part of your wealth that anchors you when everything else feels uncertain. Business gives you growth. This is where money actually multiplies, where skill, effort, and decision-making create expansion. But it also comes with volatility, cycles, and risk, and that's the part most people overestimate when things are going well. And then there's liquidity. This is the one almost everyone misunderstands. Because on the surface, it looks like it's doing nothing. It just sits there, not growing, not compounding, not exciting. But liquidity is not about return, it's about optionality. It's what allows you to act without delay. It's what keeps you from being forced into bad decisions when timing doesn't go your way. And here's where it gets deeper. These three are not just different, they are incompatible if you try to optimize them all at once. If you push too hard into business, you sacrifice stability and flexibility. If you lock too much into land, you become illiquid and slow to respond. If you hold too much cash out of fear, you lose ground over time without realizing it. There is no perfect balance where everything wins equally, and that's exactly the point. This is not about maximizing one outcome, it's about protecting against multiple failures at the same time. When I looked at my own situation through this lens, it became uncomfortable very quickly. I realized I wasn't unbalanced because I made bad decisions, I was unbalanced because I kept optimizing for what felt right in the moment. Sometimes I chased growth because I wanted to get ahead faster. Sometimes I held cash because I wanted to feel safe. Sometimes I leaned into assets because they felt solid. And each decision made sense on its own. But together, they created a structure that couldn't handle pressure. That's the subtle trap. You don't feel imbalance when things are going well. You only feel it when something changes, when you need to move, when timing matters. And in that moment, structure becomes everything. Because if your money is positioned correctly, you have options. If it isn't, you have constraints. And most people don't realize they've built constraints until it's too late. That's when this idea stopped feeling simple and started feeling precise. Not like a suggestion, but like a boundary. Because it forces you to accept something most people try to avoid. You cannot eliminate risk, but you can design a system where no single mistake destroys you, and no single opportunity passes you by. And once you start seeing this structure clearly, you also start noticing how most people, without realizing it, are operating in ways that quietly break it. The first pattern shows up in people who go all in on assets that look productive on paper: real estate, businesses, long-term investments, everything tied up in things that are supposed to grow. It feels smart, it feels disciplined, and for a while, it even works. But the weakness doesn't show when things are stable, it shows when timing turns against you, when you need access, not value. And that's where the illusion breaks, because owning something valuable is not the same as being able to use it when it matters. I've seen people with multiple properties struggle to cover a few months of cash flow. I've seen business owners with strong revenue freeze when a real opportunity appears, simply because everything they have is locked inside the business. On the outside, they look wealthy. In reality, they're constrained. Then there's the opposite pattern, the one that feels safe but quietly erodes you over time. People who hold too much in cash, not because they don't understand investing, but because they're afraid of losing what they have. It feels responsible, it feels controlled, but what's happening underneath is different. Inflation is working slowly, consistently, taking a small percentage every year, and because it's gradual, it doesn't trigger urgency. But over time, that safety turns into loss, just in a way that doesn't feel like loss in the moment. And then there's the third pattern, the one that fooled me the most, the idea of diversification that looks right on the surface. You spread your money across different assets, maybe some real estate, some investments, maybe a business, and you tell yourself you're balanced. But when you look closer, everything is still tied up, everything is still slow to access, everything still depends on time. And when time is exactly what you don't have, that kind of diversification doesn't help you, it traps you in multiple directions at once. What makes all of this dangerous is that none of these patterns feel like mistakes when you're in them. They feel like discipline. They feel like you're doing what you're supposed to do. That's why most people never question it. I didn't question it either, not until I had moments where opportunity showed up and I couldn't move, not because I didn't see it, but because I didn't have the flexibility to act. And that realization stays with you, because you understand that the problem wasn't awareness, it was structure. That's when liquidity started to change meaning for me. It stopped being something defensive, something you hold just in case things go wrong, and started becoming something strategic. It became the part of the system that gives you speed, that allows you to respond while others are still figuring out what to do. Because the truth is simple, but uncomfortable. If you need to rearrange your assets to act, you're already behind. If you need to sell under pressure, you're not making a decision, you're accepting a compromise. And the people who consistently come out ahead are not always the smartest or the most aggressive, they're the ones who are positioned to move when the moment comes. That's when you realize this isn't about avoiding risk completely. It's about avoiding a situation where risk forces you into bad decisions. And most people don't fail because they made one big mistake. They fail because their structure left them with no good options when it mattered most. And once you recognize that most people are trapped not by lack of effort but by lack of structure, the way you think about wealth starts to shift in a way that's hard to reverse. I used to think the goal was accumulation, earn more, save more, stack more, and over time, let compounding do its job. That idea sounds logical, and in stable environments, it works. But the more I paid attention, the more I realized accumulation alone doesn't protect you, because it doesn't guarantee movement. What began to make more sense was something different. Wealth is not just something you store, it's something that needs to circulate. Not randomly, not recklessly, but intentionally, across different forms, across different time horizons, across different levels of access. And that shift in thinking changes the questions you ask. Instead of asking how much am I making or how much am I growing, you start asking how is my money behaving, where is it positioned, and more importantly, when does it become available again? That last part is something most people overlook. It's not just about what you own, it's about when you can use it. If everything you have is tied to long cycles, long exits, long timelines, then you're not really in control, you're just waiting. I started looking at money less like something to hold and more like something to manage in motion. Some parts should move slowly, providing stability. Some parts should move dynamically, generating growth. And some parts should remain ready, not because they are idle, but because they are waiting for the right moment. That's when a different kind of clarity shows up. You realize that opportunity is not rare, but timing is. Opportunities exist all the time, but they only matter if you are in a position to act when they appear. And that led me to a question that honestly changed how I see everything. If the best opportunity of my life showed up tomorrow, would I be able to take it immediately, or would I have to rearrange, delay, or worse, watch it pass? Because in reality, most people don't miss opportunities because they don't recognize them. They miss them because they're not positioned for them. This is where the balance between fear and greed becomes real. On one side, fear pushes you to hold too much back, to avoid risk, to stay comfortable. On the other side, greed pushes you to commit too much, to chase growth, to stretch beyond your flexibility. Most people move between these two extremes without realizing it. They react to how they feel, not how their system is designed. But what this structure does, if you actually follow it, is remove that emotional swing. It forces you into balance, not because you feel like it, but because the system requires it. And that's a different level of discipline. It's not about being aggressive or conservative. It's about being prepared. Prepared for things to go wrong without collapsing. Prepared for things to go right without missing the moment. Because the real danger is not slow growth. The real danger is interruption. It's being taken out of the game before time has a chance to work in your favor. And once you understand that, you stop chasing the highest return, and you start building something much more valuable. A structure that allows you to stay in the game long enough for everything else to matter. And once you start seeing wealth as something that must be structured to survive, not just something to be grown, the only real question left is what do you actually change in your own life from here? For me, it didn't start with some dramatic move or a complete reset, it started with something much simpler. I sat down and looked at everything I had, not in terms of value, but in terms of behavior. What part of it was stable, what part of it was actually producing growth, and what part of it was truly accessible without friction. And that's where things got uncomfortable, because what looked balanced on the surface wasn't balanced at all. Some areas were overbuilt, others were almost non-existent, and the part one thought I understood the most turned out to be the one I had ignored. That's when I realized this is not something you fix overnight. You don't suddenly rebalance your entire life in one decision, but you can start adjusting direction, and direction, over time, is what changes outcomes. For me, that meant slowing down in places where I used to rush, not committing everything just because something looked like a good opportunity, and at the same time, being more intentional about building flexibility, even when it felt uncomfortable, even when it felt like I was not maximizing returns in the short term. It also forced me to redefine what feeling secure actually means. Because before, I used to associate security with having assets, having investments, having things that looked valuable. But now I see it differently. Security is not about what you own, it's about what you can do without being forced. Can you wait when others are rushing? Can you act when others are stuck? Can you make decisions from a position of choice instead of pressure? That's a very different definition of wealth, and it's one that doesn't show up clearly on paper, but you feel it in how you move, how you respond, how you handle uncertainty. And I'm not saying I've mastered this, far from it. I'm still adjusting, still catching myself falling back into old patterns, still learning where my own blind spots are. But the difference now is that I can see the structure, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. You stop asking what is the best investment, and you start asking whether your system can handle both loss and opportunity at the same time. Because in the end, this is not about chasing the highest return, it's about building something that doesn't break when you're wrong and doesn't freeze when you're right. If you step back and look at everything we talked about, it really comes down to one idea: wealth is not about accumulation, it's about balance across forces that behave differently under pressure. Stability protects you, growth expands you, and liquidity gives you control, and without all three working together, something will eventually give. Most people don't fail because they didn't try hard enough, they fail because they built in a way that only works when conditions are perfect, and the moment reality shows up, they're left with no good options. But if you can structure your money in a way that allows you to survive disruption and still move when opportunity appears, you don't need to be perfect. You just need to stay in the game long enough for time to work in your favor. And that, to me, is what real financial freedom starts to look like, not just having money, but having control, having flexibility, having the ability to choose your next move instead of reacting to it. So here's something I want you to think about, and I'd love to hear your answer. If a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity showed up for you tomorrow, could you actually act on it immediately, or would you need time to rearrange everything first? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you are right now in your journey, and if this gave you a new way to think about money, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because we're going deeper into this, and I want to build this journey with you.